I'm here today with Preston Stewart. Preston is a commentator on, well, world geopolitical events. Preston, I've been a big fan of your content. I actually believe it's now way more useful than the actual news of what's happening, right? And you've been covering mainly, well, recently, I guess, Israel and Ukraine mostly. Let's start at the beginning. You're a veteran, and obviously, you've come to be interested in covering the things that you've covered through your service, right? So,
I would say so, yeah.
could you tell us how does that relate and why, for instance, okay, so let's say you've been in Afghanistan, why does that make you care about Ukraine or about what's happening in Israel or whatever?
Gotcha. Well, first off, appreciate the invite there and really excited to talk with you today. I think it's all kind of intermixed. I enjoyed military history, studying military history when I was growing up, which led to wanting to go to West Point, the military academy. And when I was there, studied international relations and terrorism. This was kind of during the peak years of the U.S. war in Iraq. So I was at West Point from 2005 to 2009, and inter, you know, jihadi terrorism was pretty front and center in a lot of the things we were learning about and getting ready to go have to deal with at times overseas. And that was an interest before, during, and then after. The transition into content was I used to just study that stuff and be interested in it,
Yeah.
try to keep up with it. And about the start of COVID, like a lot of folks started talking about subjects I was interested in online. The but most of it was still military history. The kind of gateway for me was the war in Ukraine, when a lot of people I would still talk about um, kind of at that point roughly historical events in Afghanistan, Iraq, Syria. Um, but when the war in Ukraine kicked off, there was a very large audience around the world that all of a sudden was interested in learning about what they were seeing. So, what is a javelin? What is a tank being compared to artillery? Very simple concepts for folks that are in or around the military, but a broad audience that could really use help just understanding kind of the basics of what they were seeing. So I started doing that and was fortunate to pick up a little bit of an audience and just kind of rode with that because it's again topics and subjects that I'm interested in, and then as I try to expand in other areas, other hotspots.
Being Israeli, well, I am obviously biased. I would like to ask you, do they teach a lot of history regarding Israel in West Point? Because I would assume that when it comes to modern warfare, both in counterterrorism and in conventional wars, Israel has a lot of material to offer, right? From 67, the importance of air superiority, I would guess, right? Is 73 tank battles. And well, reserves and how all that logistic system works, and then counterterrorism from the late 80s and early 2000s, right? So I was just curious if as someone who's been there, d- d- what do you study? Like,
It's pretty normal curriculum, all things considered. I wouldn't say that Israel played more or less of a role. I mean, we studied the historic events from Israel, but not not more than you would think from like a traditional historical perspective.
mhm.
I don't recall much in the military classes there, but a lot of it at that time was we have our history class, and of course, the history class is going to hit on the 1973 war, all of those different battles that and wars that Israel's involved with. But the military tactics and all of that was much more current and more focused on like doctrine than really looking back towards any military. But the curriculum there tends to be, you come out with a Bachelor of Science degree, and like you have to take calculus and history and chemistry and all of that stuff. So the military aspect is relatively small in terms of like what you're learning in the classroom.
I see. And am I correct to say that you are, well, you try to be neutral, right? You just explain things. You don't cheer for Israel like when you cover Israel. You just say what you see, right? Or you don't. But I do get the impression that you're very strongly pro-Ukraine in the Ukraine war. Would that be a correct assessment? And if so, then why?
Yeah, I it's not a content decision per se to want to appear neutral, or I think we're in the same boat. We were talking about this earlier, where this is kind of the new media, and this is where people get their information. And it's so frustrating when you tune in somewhere and you don't know what you're getting. Like how much of it is being withheld, or are you just getting one side of the story? And I hate that. It's so frustrating and so confusing. So I really try to just present the information that we have, which at times means saying this is what Russia is saying. This is what Hamas announced earlier today, even though I know that's probably not accurate. But I think there's some value in understanding that's what this group or this country is saying. As these conflicts have played out, I have made a lot of friends in Ukraine and in the Ukraine space, and yeah, I think what Russia is doing there is wrong, top to bottom, and I have a lot of sympathy for the Ukrainian people just wanting to go about a normal life. They don't want war. They want peace. And I have found myself more and more. Um, I'd like to see them victorious, I think is the way to put it.
Okay, but is this okay? So what you've just presented is an emotional preference for
Yes.
Ukraine, let's say. Do you think there's also a policy preference for Ukraine? Because we hear a lot of voices in America today that would argue on the contrary, right?
Sure. Yeah. I'm mixed. I think we do a we do a bad job, I think, online of trying to condense everything down to, option A or option B, and I have a lot of mixed feelings on this. So I I think that supporting Ukraine is in our best interest in the United States. I think first and foremost, my loyalties are here to the United States, and the reason that I would like to see Ukraine succeed in this war is partially because I feel like they're in an awful spot, but also because I think it's in the U.S. best interests for Russia to be pushed back and to show other large countries and militaries around the world you can't do this, and that we stand with our allies. So I think there's an overwhelming benefit to the United States to support Ukraine and see them through to a victory to where they maintain their sovereignty. Um, I try to stay a little bit away from the specific policies. I would say by and large, I think the support of Ukraine has been positive. I think we haven't put forward a good end state. So the policies at this point seem very much like we're trying to keep Ukraine alive. It does not look like we're trying to accomplish some goal. I don't know what the end goal is for United States aid to Ukraine other than survival. And it seems like that's missing at this point. But the same thing with policies. I really try to. It's easy when there's just one administration, and you can kind of say this is what the policy is. A little more difficult now as we're seeing kind of a transition across the U.S. government to see how those policies might change. But I'll do my best to present those and try to show the pros and cons of each.
So just in favor of people who are tuning in from the future, we're talking right now just in the transition period between Biden and Trump, right? So that's why you've said that. Okay. How about Israel? Like, you. Okay, so you don't feel like you need to wave the Israeli flag as much as you do the Ukrainian flag. That's how I see your things. But when I look at what's happening in the US, and I'm an outsider, so I count only on social media, but that's not nothing. I see something that for me as an Israeli and more likely as a Jew is kind of worrying. A lot of voices around. I think you've actually presented on your channel a poll that asks what is the largest threat, what country is the biggest threat to the United States, and you've showed results from right after October 7th of 2023, and I think it said like what 5% say that Israel is the biggest threat to the United States, something like that, right?
Yeah, it's
So
crazy.
so that had me worried. But what do you make of that? Well, I know it's not exactly warfare, but warfare is made out of societies, right? So
Yeah, I will contradict myself because I'm a person and I've got flaws in all sorts of different directions. I have found myself wanting to be more vocal of support for Ukraine, which does not mean not presenting when bad things happen, right? They have been losing territory for months now. They do not have the momentum. I don't think it does anybody any good to sugarcoat something, or like I think that's actually more detrimental. But just a personal opinion, I think Israel is able to defend themselves. And I mean they've shown in the last few months, last 18 months or so, that they're very capable of handling their regional enemies, if you will, on their own. Whereas, so if the United States were to step back a little bit in that relationship, as we kind of saw at times in the last few months, Israel still got things under control. It might have been a little harder, or maybe not how each party wants to proceed going forward. But if that same situation played out with Ukraine, they probably would cease to exist, or the war would change drastically.
Oh yeah.
So, just a personal opinion on that front. I don't know how to. The general stance that I have with U.S. support for Israel is that it really hasn't changed all that much. We see some loud voices online, but the aid shipments, the military shipments, are still going.
Yeah.
And you just saw this new administration that's coming in is arguably going to be the most pro-Israeli administration probably in my lifetime.
Yeah.
So yeah, there's loud voices. I don't know that that's translated to very much in terms of changing the relationship at all.
Yet.
But I'd be interested in your thoughts on that because I'm viewing that from an American perspective.
Yeah, well, my worries are that this will become more normalized. Like for me, it's like this. Okay, let's put it this way. Think about 9/11. Okay, we have 9/11 Memorial Day each year, every year. But at some point, we run out of things to say about 9/11. Or at least, it's not that we run out of things to say, it's that we don't say enough new things about 9/11. So in the new world of social media, in order to get attention, you need to say something new. So here's an example of something new that you can say about 9/11. It was an inside job, and here's my case, right? And whoa, that's something exciting and new. And
Wait a minute, yeah.
yeah, and maybe 15 years ago this was unacceptable to say, but wait, I know, because it's been so long, I no longer feel the urge to be loyal to the original narrative, right? Or in 30 years, maybe it was the Jews. The Jews were dancing, right? There's this dancing Jews conspiracy, something like that. Or, take the Holocaust, right? You can't doubt the Holocaust. There are movies, Schindler's List, all that. But I don't know, in a couple of dozens more years, maybe it's more interesting to talk about how the numbers have maybe been inflated and maybe it wasn't exactly like this, So, like, I am worried about seeing a shift and hearing voices who are blatantly anti conspiracy theories essentially, but
Yeah.
these end up sticking to the Jews also quite often, and now it's also very easy to stick it to Israel. So that's how I see it. Do I feel like it's something that's inevitable? And for sure, no, I definitely don't. But it's something that's happening there in the background. Like you can kind of feel it, especially if you're sensitive to it. Well, I guess I am sensitive to it, right? For obvious reasons. So yeah, that's my input. What do you think of that?
Yeah, that makes sense. And what you said there at the end, I think nailed it, where it's something you're more sensitive to. So you're kind of more attuned to that taking form, even if it is a fraction of a percent somewhere. Because I was, your example with the Holocaust, like the vast majority of the world recognizes exactly what happened there. And it's not a question. The tiny little fraction that is loud and obnoxious that talks about it, like it's a problem. I'd like that to be not a thing at all. But how much attention do you pay to that? And I don't know the right answer to that
Yeah.
because we're never going to get to zero on any of this stuff. So but I understand it's any movement in that direction can be concerning.
Yeah, I see. Okay, well, thanks for addressing that. What's your experience, like your personal experience with, well, I guess I'm going to say Islamic terrorism, but you can rephrase it if you'd like.
Yeah, that was what drove me into the military in the first place. I do have family that was in the military, but I was in high school. I was 15 years old when the 9/11 attacks occurred, and it's a time in your life when you're making those decisions on what you're going to do when you grow up. So that directly led to where my life is today. I ended up going to Afghanistan as part of my time in the military. There, we were fighting the Taliban, just in the location we were at, and there wasn't Al Qaeda or a significant Al Qaeda presence. Islamic State wasn't
Wait,
really a thing.
I'm gonna stop you for a second. Please explain to the audience the difference between the Taliban, Al Qaeda, and Islamic State. Well, Islamic State, I guess it's more obvious. So let's do the Taliban and Al Qaeda at least.
We'll do them all. It's worth jumping into. So
Sure.
the Taliban, very it's the Islamic Emirate of Afghanistan. So think of the Taliban as almost exclusively focused on running the country of Afghanistan. That's largely what they were before the United States. They're not good, right? An oppressive regime in a lot of ways. They implement Sharia law against with their civilians, and there's a lot of brutality in that country. So that doesn't mean they're good, but they're very focused on Afghanistan. They're not really exporting that ideology. Al Qaeda global movement. Their focus is on toppling countries like the United States abroad to pave the way for a future Islamic caliphate. Islamic State turns that around a little bit and says we are going to establish local caliphates, local provinces around the world, and we're going to expand from there. So there's actually it's a weird dynamic right now where the Taliban.
It's in between Al Qaeda and the Taliban, right? Like,
Yeah, so the Taliban is actively killing Islamic State fighters and they're housing Al Qaeda members. Islamic State and Al Qaeda have fought in recent years. It's just, yeah, all bad, different degrees of bad.
you know, while you were explaining this, I actually had a thought occur to me that the Iranian Revolutionary Guard is, well, it could in a sense be worse than these two because it's so you've said the Taliban is very cruel, etc., but it focuses on Afghanistan. But the
Mhm.
Revolutionary Guard, by definition, its purpose is to export the Islamic revolution, right? They're Shiite and not Sunni, of
Mhm.
course, from Iran, but so they're not the Taliban. They're like more aggressive in this sense, right? They won't keep to themselves. But I guess because they have a state behind them, they won't be as reckless as Al Qaeda. So, as you were speaking, I was thinking to myself, well, I don't really see that much difference between the Islamic State and the Revolutionary Guard. The only difference is being, I guess, Sunni versus Shiite, and also the fact that the Islamic State doesn't really have a state behind it, like that needs to survive and not be toppled by its own population, while the Revolutionary Guard does. So what do you think of that?
I think you hit on something there that's really interesting is in the United States, our experience is Sunni organizations. That's who we have. We fought the Taliban, we fought Al Qaeda, we fought Islamic State. We haven't really, when we think in the last 20 years or so, the fight has been much more against Sunni groups than Shia groups. And I think that's been a conflict in the last 18 months or so when we saw Hamas, Hezbollah, the Houthis, even Iran, well, Hamas, of course, being Sunni, but nonetheless kind of tied into that whole Iranian axis. I think there's been we're kind of tripping over ourselves because we have Islamic terror is bad, but we kind of stop with Al Qaeda, Islamic State, and the Taliban and just haven't paid as much attention to the Shia side of things. Whereas my guess is in Israel, it's probably been a little bit inverse, more focus on some of those Shia groups.
Well, in Israel, actually, people haven't been so educated about the differences between them until relatively recently because it's
Okay.
become an interesting topic. But uh, so here's the thing. I follow like what the Iranians are saying because the Iranians are trying to talk to the West. They know that it's in their best interest to try to talk and to try to sell their narrative essentially. And
Hmm.
they're investing quite a bit of money in doing that in university campuses, for example. And Iran keeps referring to their enemies as ISIS and Al Qaeda. I mean, they do it they do it on purpose because they know that the Americans, they say, oh, these guys are against ISIS, so they must be good, right? For example, what happened when the Syrian regime fell? What did the Iranians and Russians say? Like, who toppled the regime? I think I've even heard you say it. I might be mistaken, but it's ISIS, right?
Yeah, yeah,
So,
yeah. Because
so
nobody likes ISIS, right?
yeah.
Yeah.
So if you're listening to the Iranians and the Russians, all you hear is, well, ISIS. Oh, and they could like hint that they're backed by Israel, right? Because Israel attacked Hezbollah, and then Hezbollah was weakened, and then ISIS could take over Syria. So the evil Zionists are in cahoots with the Sunnis, right? So, but you're saying that, as far as you're concerned, that narrative that attempts to be sold is, well, doesn't have many buyers.
I think it ends up getting too complicated too quick for a lot of people too. It was really easy, again, speaking for all Americans, which is hyper risky.
Yeah.
It was very easy when we had bin Laden was the bad guy and he ran Al Qaeda. I think when bin Laden died and Zawahiri came in, people were probably starting to lose track at that point. Um, it's 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 hard. Like, wait, who's the bad guy? Who's the group? Islamic State splits off. Are they the same? And I think it just got, I think it gets very complicated and people kind of tune out in a sense.
Do you think that Israel achieving favorable military results is in the United States' interest?
Yes.
Please tell me why.
Well, we just spent a while talking about similar adversaries and something we talked earlier about how you're more attuned to certain things than I am, and vice versa. Something that I caught on to pretty shortly after the October 7th attacks was everything Israel did gets blamed on the United States. Like everything. Every person who died in Gaza, if you look at Hamas statements and Hezbollah statements and Iranian statements, they put the United States and Israel right there. And as an American, I get concerned looking around saying how many people are just taking that at face value and thinking that the Israeli military that is planning, resourcing, and conducting their own operations, that's not the United States. But the way these groups present it is like it's an American soldier on the ground in Israel.
Do you remember the rescue operation that there was? I think it was around May, it was in the summer, I think. It was about half a year ago. And a lot of people blamed the United States for building, I think it was some sort of something, maybe a port, a
The little
temporary
pier
port.
there, yeah.
Yeah, a little pier. And they blamed the United States for conducting the massacre. That's how they called the rescue operations, because many Palestinians were killed, of course. So this the type of thing that you're talking about? I guess that's one example.
That's a good one because that was front and center in a lot of things. I mean, they were saying that the United States directly facilitated that. And it's a little bit frustrating because a lot of it has kind of been with this undertone that Israel is not capable of doing these things. Like, come on. We just saw a couple days ago they went into Syria.
Actually, I think you're okay. Yeah, but please go on with Syria, and then I have something for you.
Well, they just clearly the Israeli military is very capable. And I think a lot of this has the undertone that they wouldn't be able to do X, Y, or Z. It has to be the United States doing it. And we've seen similar comments out of Ukraine. And it's just, like, come on. There are other very, very capable militaries around the world able to do this stuff.
Yeah, it's a shame that how incapable the Israeli army was prior to the October 7th attacks, but it seems like since then it's kind of woken up. But here's what I wanted to tell you. Do you know, like, the Houthi music clips? I guess you've
I've
seen
seen some
some
of
of
them.
them.
Yeah, yeah.
Right. There was a music video where the Houthis basically show how well, they dress like Orthodox Jews. Have you seen this? So yeah, that's like a very deeply held narrative in the Arab world. It's like the Jews, and the Jews also control the United States. So by the end of the clip, the Jew guy is like dancing on the table and humiliating all the Arab states who are obviously Western puppets, right? Saudi Arabia, Egypt, Jordan, they're all traitors and collaborators, according to the mainstream Arab narrative. And by the end of the music clip, a Hamas guy comes in, grabs the Jew, and drags him away. And then it cuts to an American sitting like on his chair, watching this unfold on TV and running away. So that's like, like the backers of the Israelis are the Americans, and
Yeah.
you scare them away by defeating the Israelis. So that's one. And also another thing that I think I recognize, because I try to follow the Arab narrative quite a bit, is that it seems to me like it's painful for them to acknowledge that the Jews can be strong and capable. So there always has to be a backer. For example, if you were to think about the 48 war, how they tell the story, they would really emphasize how the Jews were supported by, well, they would say the Soviet Union because there was I don't know, you probably haven't studied this, maybe you have, but there's been like from Czechoslovakia lots of weapons shipments that turned the tide of the war at one point. And then
Okay.
after that, it's 56 with the French and the British attacking Egypt, and then Israel basically conspiring with them and joining in. And then after the 67 war, it's the Americans who began to back Israel. So it's always like this thought that the Americans cannot stand on themselves. Plus, Israel is a colonial project, right? I bet you must have heard of that. And
Couple
the
times.
and the colony needs a country to send it, right? I mean, the 13 colonies were British, right? So if Israel is a colony, then who sent them? So there has to be a backer. So I guess this is what's behind this. But I want to challenge what you've said about Israel being about this being in the United States' interest, because you've
Sure.
said that lots of what's happening is being blamed on the United States. People like John Mearsheimer, for example, would use this exact argument to state that the US should not support Israel, right? Because if we're being blamed, I mean, I think John Mearsheimer even hints in his book, The Israel Lobby, that 9/11 was in part a response for US support of Israel, right? So why, what do you make of that?
Well, I mean, so bin Laden threw that net wide, right? And one of the reasons that Al Qaeda was formed and didn't like the United States is because of U.S. support for Israel. It's just a rallying cry for any group, any jihadi group. When I was at West Point, I remember an instructor saying, anytime you see an attack, expect them to blame it on U.S. support for Israel or Israel, because it's just like you're not going to upset anybody doing that. It's going to rally everybody to the cause. So I don't pay a whole lot of attention to that. It's kind of water under the bridge. But in terms of Israeli success, military success, being in U.S. interests, broadly, yes. Now, at baseline, no two countries are ever going to have their interests aligned 100%, ever. Even the closest of allies are going to have a difference of opinion in something. And there's a ton of examples here because Israel's fighting wars on their borders. They're going to inherently view that differently than the United States will, without doubt. Generally speaking, these groups don't like us, the United States. Hezbollah, Hamas, Houthis, Iran. So if we are able to get to a position where they are not in a position of authority, I feel like that's a benefit to the United States. It sounds like Mearsheimer's kind of in the inverse there of because of Israel, these groups exist, but if they're out there, they were out there for quite a while. If not the specific group, then the ideology. I would just like to not see them, in Hezbollah's case, governing, a militia in the southern portion of Lebanon. The Houthis essentially controlling half of Yemen. I'd like to see those groups not in charge of anything. So if that means that so in turn that's Israeli military success against these organizations. I think that helps us.
Yeah, I think so too. I just wanted to ask you like about the inverse version. Okay.
Now, to stick with that for a second, I was going
Yeah.
to say I think it can go too far. Um, I, I try very hard I'm sitting in a comfortable office in Tennessee, in the middle of the United States. I'm not the one making battlefield decisions that cost life and death. So I try very hard not to nitpick operations after they play out, but you have there's plenty of times throughout the war in Gaza specifically where Israel probably could have done things differently. And the fact that some of the bombing campaigns, some of the artillery being used in a congested area like that, I don't know that that was a net benefit for the United States. But very big picture, the elimination of Hamas, that would be.
Yeah. And well, here's the thing. Like, I feel maybe it's mistaken, but I feel like the scrutiny that Israel goes through is way higher than pretty much anything else that we've ever seen, right? I mean, no one goes and sees what size of bombs the Russians are using against which targets. You know what I mean? So inevitably there have been mistakes. I mean, even if you make one mistake in 100, that would probably still be thousands of mistakes made throughout the
Yeah.
war. But I guess that's how it is. What do you think of war with Iran in general? Not that I'm advocating for it. I just want to hear your thoughts as someone who's studied this area and thought about it for quite some time.
Well, it's very different. It's a very different concept today than it was even just a few months ago, I would say. Again, I don't want to, I'm not going to advocate for a war with Iran. I think that'd be incredibly costly, not just in terms of military personnel, but there'd probably be a lot of Iranian citizens that died, and probably a lot of other civilians throughout the Middle East that would suffer, likely lose their lives in a conflict of that scale. Um, I think 6 months ago, it was hard to imagine how that could play out because Iran had their proxies. Even if Khamenei says they don't have proxies and they don't need them, they did. And that's always been the major concern, not just for Israel with Hezbollah up north, but with U.S. forces in the region as well. What would these proxies do to our forces in Western Iraq, in Eastern Syria, in Qatar, maybe even? Um, the last few months, it's a drastically different battlefield. Hezbollah is essentially out of the fight. Hamas is essentially out of the fight. The Houthis are still kind of doing their thing, but kind of the major, I don't think there's any argument that Iran can go toe to toe with the United States or Israel in a conventional fight. That's not a fair fight. That's going to be overwhelming victory for the United States and Israel. It could come with a cost. So Iran has always been relying on these proxy forces, the unconventional kind of shadow war, and they've looked pretty neutered in the last few months. I think we need to be careful to not overestimate their losses, if you will. But I wouldn't be shocked at all if there's real conversations going on in Israel and in the incoming U.S. administration to carry out some sort of attack against Iran. It doesn't feel that far off.
I would just like to add that I think your analysis was fantastic, but I would just like to add that I believe, of course, I might be mistaken, but I think that if Iranian citizens were to die as a result of an attack on Iran, it would really surprise me. Because, as far as I understand, the Western narrative that exists both in Israel and the United States is that Iran is the citizens of Iran can be used against it. And so the last thing that you would want to do is to harm civilian populations or civilian centers, right? So, unlike, by the way, the Muslim narrative against Israel, because the Muslim narrative against Israel is that Israel is very close to collapsing. It's just a matter of, just a little push, and the country is gone, and Palestine will finally be free. And if that's your narrative, it makes a lot of sense to attack civilians because they will just flee, and you will achieve your goal, right? But if your narrative is that the regime is about to collapse from within, then it's not in your interest at all to attack civilians. That's how I understand it.
I see a lot of comments on my channel anytime I talk about anything Iran related of people saying I'm Iranian or my family's in Iran. They do not like Khamenei.
Yeah.
And maybe it's a skewed sample because these are the ones who are accessing, English speaking languages, or English speaking channels. But it doesn't compare to any other region that I've talked about. You talk about China and Taiwan, I'll get plenty of Chinese folks very upset in the comment
Yeah.
section.
Yeah. You
Um,
won't have anyone saying, "How dare you talk like this about the Communist Party? I'm Chinese." You know?
but the other side, you get a lot of people hoping for a better future in Iran that does not involve, the IRGC.
Yeah, IRGC, just to make it clear, it's the Iranian Revolutionary Guard. That's what you meant by that, right? So, how do you see what's happening in the Middle East and in Ukraine as being connected? Because obviously they are, but I think I'd like to hear your take on it as someone who's sitting in the US and maybe gets a larger picture than I do.
Sure. So there's a direct connection right now in the sense that about 2 years ago, Russia looked to Iran to help backfill some of their missile stockpiles. And there was a debate about whether some ballistic missiles would make the trip over to Russia. It's not clear if those did, but Iran did supply Russia with the Shahed style drones and a lot of them. And they looks like they probably sold the manufacturing rights or the design or something. Russia's manufacturing their own now, but it's something like more than 1,000 of those were launched against Ukraine last year alone. And these are
These are
big.
suicide drones, right?
Yep, the
Well,
big
I guess you
triangle
can tell from
ones.
from the name, right? Shahed or Shahid. So, a martyr in English.
So it's yeah, the big triangle shape. They're slow cruise missiles. They're easy to shoot down, but they're cheap. Iran in their attacks against Israel in the first one launched a lot of these as well. And I think every one of them was shot down. But they still serve a significant as a significant problem because it takes up resources trying to intercept these things that can do a lot of damage when they impact.
Yeah, and it's normally
So
more expensive to intercept them than it is to send them.
100%. These are incredibly cheap. And so Iran has been supplying Russia with weapons that have been used to kill Ukrainian civilians. A lot of the Shaheds, they're not used against military outposts, they're used against city centers and things like that. So Iran had a direct role in that fight. In return, it's not entirely clear at this point, other than money, what Russia had sent to Iran. But those same Shahed drones have now been used by Iran, by the Houthis. They have their own version. It's the same thing. So you're seeing Iranian weapons used in Ukraine, and it looks like there might be even more potentially multiple launch rocket systems and air defense assets making the trip to Russia in the very near future. So there's a very concrete connection between those two, with a lot of questions of what's Iran getting out of this, other than probably some cash.
Can you think of what else Iran might be getting out of this? Out of this, because I guess they could get cash in other ways as well, right? So, I guess here's the way to get cash: stop financing Assad, for example, or Hezbollah. Well, let's ignore the fact that the Syrian regime fell. We'll get to that in a minute. But so there has to be an interest here, right? And I think the interest might be in the alignment, right? There's like this global realignment across West, it's Israel, the US, Europe is kind of weird in there, actually, which is funny. you know, they haven't made up their mind. Well, they have made up their minds with regards to Russia, I guess,
Mhm.
but not so much with regards to Iran, it would seem. Yeah. What do you
Yeah,
think?
I think so. The most concerning one, and I don't think there's been any evidence to support this, but of course they have to bring it up, is the idea that Russia could share nuclear technology with Iran. Again, not seen any evidence to support that. It's just if you're trading something, what is something that Russia has that Iran might want? And then immediately behind that is all sorts of military technology, whether it's giving, one for one, you give us some of these Shaheds, we'll give you air defense assets or tanks or fighter jets, or if it's, specific missile types or components that Iran can't get elsewhere. I mean, when their president died about a year ago or something, they were flying like a 1980s style helicopter. So Iran has a lot of room to make up in their military equipment that Russia could backfill.
Yeah, now's the time to do it actually, because if you've lost all your proxies, you need to get your air defenses in order and your air force, right? You have to, because right now you're almost naked. So
Yeah, and Israel's shown that a couple times, right? There's been a couple strikes inside of Iran where it's just been, how did that get there? They're not supposed to be able to do that. So
okay, but so there's of course more going on here, right? Because Russia, I guess, being tied up in Ukraine, has been less able to divert resources in order to support Assad in Syria. And the same goes, of course, for Iran, which was supporting Assad. Please correct me if I'm wrong. Primarily through Hezbollah, and once Hezbollah has been neutral, neutralized mostly, where does that leave Syria? Well, we've seen what happened.
yeah, it's this kind of the second order effects, I'd say, and then you get into the third and fourth, and it gets really messy just because there's so much trade and communication around the world. But that was one of the big arguments as to why HTS had so much success against Assad so quickly. I mean, I'm
So
sure you were
just to make it
following it.
clear for the audience, please explain HTS.
Hayat Tahrir al-Sham. So it formerly, to sum it up, it's a jihadi organization in Syria. They used to run Idlib province in the northwest, and their roots go back to Al Qaeda in Iraq with their current leader Jalani. So, jihadi organization today. It's the group in charge of all of Syria.
Yeah. Okay, that's the group that basically won the civil war. What's their connection to Turkey?
That one's still up in the air, so I'd have to rely on Syria's so messy, as you well know. there have been allegations of connections there. I've not seen anything direct. The biggest push has been that Turkey kind of didn't intervene when HTS began this offensive, but I don't know that I would put that in the camp of necessarily backed by Turkey or anything like
Yeah,
that.
Israel didn't intervene either, and Hezbollah, right? So that doesn't
Yeah.
necessarily mean something. Although I guess it does because Turkey has been way more active in the Syrian civil war than Israel. Israel was just mainly bombing Iran. In Hebrew, we have this term. It's called Mabam. It's an acronym, and it means, roughly translated, the the war between wars, something like that.
Mm.
So that's the word that's used to describe within the Israeli security apparatus. It's used to describe the, say, Cold War between Israel and Iran that's
Yeah.
been unfolding over the past, what, 15 years or however long. And a large part, a large front of this Mabam has been Syria because Israel did not want Iran to settle in Syria. And by the way, I used to think until what happened until October 7th and the successes that the IDF has had since, although of course October 7th was a terrible failure and the hostages are still in Gaza. Um, I used to think that Israel was actually losing the Mabam against Iran because Iran did take over Lebanon. They did have a lot of influence over Syria, enough to have, basically access to the northern Israeli border, right? And they had so it's like a land bridge. It's Iran, Iraq, Syria, and then you get to
Mhm.
Israel's northern border. So I used to think Israel was losing, and
I can see how you'd get there. Yeah.
yeah, and I actually think that October 7th could, okay, not that event, but an October 7th like event could have destroyed Israel. I do think so, actually, because I think what happened. I'd love to have your input on this. It seems to me that Hamas was reluctant to share its plan with his allies, because, well, because of intelligence. Obviously, we've seen what Israel did to Hezbollah and to Iraq. We see the intelligence capacities of Israel, and obviously the Israelis were blind when it came to Hamas. So Sinwar did not want to share his plans with the so-called axis of resistance. But if all the forces were to attack Israel at the same time, Hezbollah from the north, Hamas from the south, maybe some Iraqi militias, maybe, you could get some Hezbollah from Syria as well. You have some cells in Jordan, I believe,
Mhm.
that really would not love nothing more than to march into so-called occupied Palestine and liberate it, and the Arabs living in the West Bank. And add to that, what's called in Arabic, they call it the interior, the Arabs of the interior. They mean the Arab Israeli citizens. There are many weapon stashes within this community in Israel, and it's a known threat in the Israeli defense apparatus. So a theoretical attack like that, that could have been a surprise like October 7th. I mean, what does it take? It's a small country. You get to the places of power. You pull whoever you need to pull out of the building, and the political entity kind of collapses. There might still be resistance, but as an organized political entity, you've kind of won, right?
I don't think that's crazy. I mean, I remember the days after the October 7th attack, kind of sitting on pins and needles. And again, I'm not on the ground, so I can't imagine what it was like for people, especially in northern Israel, wondering, was that just the beginning?
Yeah, yeah. So it's interesting that I think that the IDF has been able to turn it around in this way. I, do the Americans learn from Israel's successes in your estimation? Like, is there a lot of cooperation there? Like sending a guy from West Point, here is what, and Israel shows him, here's what we did, here's how you can replicate it. Do you think that there's this kind of relations?
I'm smiling a little bit because we tend to be really bad at that at times. Um, I think we're doing a really poor job in related to the war in Ukraine, understanding how drones are going to affect the battlefield. I think we dropped the ball there. I feel good about what we're probably taking away from the war in Gaza. As actually a good friend of mine was there throughout the majority of it. He was working for what's the administration that kind of oversees the West Bank. There's a U.S. general that's there.
Oh, I think they're the ones who are training the Palestinian security services, right? Is that the one you mean?
Maybe it's like a two-star U.S. general. That's not my friend. I'm not that fancy, but
Mm.
his aide was a good friend of mine. We still chat all the time. West Point guy, graduated the year before me, and he's there living in Israel for years at a time, developing these relationships to build this kind of trust and bring these tactics back to the U.S. And from my understanding, there's a fair amount of still cooperation and coordination for lessons learned at the right levels across the force. I think that's drowned out because the hostage rescue operation, for instance, I believe Shin Bet led that one. I guarantee there are organizations in the United States that have now had Zoom calls and one-on-one sessions to learn from that.
Hmm.
But instead, what we see on social media is protests and people yelling about Israeli actions. So I think the right conversations are being had
I
with the
think it's
right
part of
people.
the war, actually. I have to be honest. I think it's part of the war effort.
The protests and such.
Yes. Well,
Yeah.
you can't. Here's the thing. I'm not blaming any American that goes to protest against Israel as taking part in the general war against it. Right. Right. That's not exactly what I mean. But I mean that the incitement and the general mood is actually a weapon of war that's being used by Israel's enemies, but also the U.S.'s enemies to undermine it. I think. Do you sometimes follow Pierce Morgan's show, for example?
I've seen clips.
Have you
Yeah.
seen the Iranian guy that keeps coming on there?
I don't think so.
Okay, so there's this Iranian professor who's obviously an Iranian propagandist, and he obviously tells these fancy stories and tales, and it's a tool. It's a weapon of war, and the Iranians have actually been investing quite a bit of money into changing the narrative, especially on campus grounds. Of course, the Qataris are a well-known example, but the Iranians have been doing this as well. And again, this is worrying for me as an Israeli.
It's been interesting to see that with the protests because I happened to be in Washington, D.C. during some of the early ones and was walking down the street and saw one of them and thought, well, I'll just go see what's going on here. And it was great. It was peaceful. It was all about release the hostages, find peace, stop bombing. You'd be hard pressed to walk through that and think that there was anything like wrong or pushed or anything. It just felt like people that wanted to see an end to violence. But you've seen this like wave where at times the protests just get out of control and then they just die off. And I don't know the last time there was one in the news here. I don't know if that means they're not happening or if they're not getting as much coverage, but it does feel like that sentiment has kind of died down, I think.
Do you know who Mohammed Deif is? Well, I guess you do know, right? He was the head of the military wing of Hamas, right?
Yeah.
The Izzadin al-Qassam brigades. And he has a speech. I've seen it translated into Hebrew. I don't know if I have it translated into English, but the speech he gave on the day of the attacks and broadcast to the entire, what he would call the Muslim Ummah, right? The nation of Islam, I guess it would roughly translate into. And he called upon, well, as I told you, he called upon the Muslims in Lebanon, the resistance in Lebanon to attack, and
Yeah.
in the occupied internal Palestine, which is the Israeli Arabs and the West Bank and all that. And interestingly, at the end of all these Muslims he's listing that he calls upon for help, he calls upon the Muslims around the world and especially in the West to go out into the streets and do whatever they can to help the war effort, essentially. And, I guess today people will really not like me saying this. They say you're Islamophobic, but you can go and read it. It's out there. And interestingly, the Muslims of Lebanon, they helped with some rockets, but they didn't invade Israel. The Muslims for Jordan didn't invade. The West Bank didn't rise up not as much as they wanted it to. The so-called Arabs of the interior didn't rise up. But interestingly, the Muslims of the West did rally to the flag. And I think on the same day of the 7th of October, or it was the 8th, there were massive protests erupting, anti-Israel protests, and it was before Israel even did anything, like in retaliation, right? So I do see, like, it's hard to pinpoint because it's not exactly a war that I can say, here are the opposing forces and
Mhm.
these guys do this and these guys do that. But I feel like there is something that's happening here that's deeper and that is already in the way. Well, the US not so much, but Europe certainly. So that's how I see it. What do you think
Yeah,
about that?
that there was right after the 7th. I remember, I mean, we always hear about, there's anti-Semitism here or there, or it's a problem in this country or that. And like, look, sometimes you kind of get numb to it. You hear that everything is racism or anti-Semitism, and you just kind of like, I don't know, I don't see it. I live in the middle of the United States. I don't feel like I'm just looking past it. It was really eye-opening the days after, weeks, probably even, maybe even months after October 7th. You started to see like genuine hate messages, anti-Semitic hate messages. And it was, I guess, kind of grappling with that didn't just come out of nowhere. It was more that it was permitted because of the environment, because of the protests, maybe, right? People felt more confident in saying maybe what they felt for a while. So that was an eye opener for me. I never thought that anti-Semitism was gone, but it felt like it was much more pronounced, at least for a period of time, than I ever would have expected.
Yeah, that's crazy. Both from the left and the right, actually, and for different reasons, which is interesting. And
Yeah.
I've seen also interesting things. But maybe I could show you later. But like I've seen that the YouTubers, the very big YouTubers in in the Arabic language, let's say they give you a rundown of the interwar period in Europe, like the years right before World War II.
Hmm.
You get the Nazi narrative essentially. You get like the Germans were backstabbed, and then
Oh,
like Berlin started to become decadent because there was some portion of the population who was being subversive, um, and then maybe they were also in touch with the Zionists in Palestine, and then the Nazi Party came and gave everyone jobs, and it was better. But then you get what I mean, right? So
anytime you start a story about World War II with the Germans were stabbed in the back, you know it's heading in the wrong direction.
yeah, exactly. You know this because you've studied some history, but these people would also say that they've studied the real history,
Yeah,
not
sure.
your sheep history, right?
It's good.
Yeah, I guess that's a well. I guess it's an optimist note. What do you make? Speaking of optimism, what are your bets for Syria in the coming years?
I am trying to be optimistic there. And the reason I say that is look, HTS, Jolani, the guy leading that group, if the US or Israel had killed him in a drone strike 6 months ago, nobody would have batted an eye. Like he, the leader of a jihadi organization. I'm hearing a lot of people in Syria and people that I respect that follow the space that are optimistic and saying that there's a lot of Syrians on the ground that are happier now and they're more confident in where the country's headed. So I'm trying so hard to defer to that. Those are the people that have to live with this and live in these conditions. If they're optimistic, who am I on the outside to be pessimistic? So hopefully for the people of Syria, it's not going to be a Western style democracy. If that's our goal, then we're going to miss it.
Yeah, I think we
But
learned this in Iraq, right? Like,
if it's better than Assad and doesn't house international terrorist organizations, then all right, let's maybe that's the best case. What do you think?
well, obviously, everything you've said is, I believe that as well. But I think, again, as an Israeli, I look towards the dynamics of the region. I think it's good that Syria has been taken away from the so-called axis of resistance, and also that's going to make it more difficult to arm Hezbollah, which will also change things in Lebanon, hopefully for the better. Um, What I'm worried about Turkey, actually, because I think that Turkey, with the fall of Assad and with the weakening of Iran, um, Syria could go back to its historical role, which is to be the battlegrounds between the Turkish Empire and the Persian Empire, right? Like that's pretty much always where it's been at for the last couple of hundreds of years. So the Turkish forces, what I'm mainly worried about is that they start to have dreams of empire. I think President Erdogan is talking openly about it. He's said several times that the next stop is Damascus, but the one after that is Al-Quds. Al-Quds is the Arab name for Jerusalem. So
Yeah,
yeah, lovely.
easy, man. Yeah,
Yeah, lovely. But because why? Because once you have your influence in Syria, well, maybe the next step is the further
interesting.
beyond, and they could get an excuse to invade if the Kurds manage to get independence from Al Jolani, right? Like if Syria doesn't hold together and kind of falls apart, let's say that that the Kurds get their autonomy, Turkey will never stand for that
Right.
because that would just make a mess for their Kurds, right? So they would occupy, and I don't want to see Israel having Turkish soldiers on their borders on the Golan Heights, NATO members. That makes it even worse. So, all in all, I'm optimistic, like you are. I don't like the Turkey part. That's the one thing I'm
Interesting.
a bit
Yeah,
sour about. But I guess,
totally valid.
yeah, that remains to be seen. That could be dangerous. I guess that's also not good for NATO, right? That's a lot of drama and trouble, and I guess Turkey is in NATO for historical reasons, right?
Yeah, if a NATO country starts invading the countries around them, it turns into a real issue with how we talk about
Yeah,
Ukraine.
but that's an intervention, right? We're only intervening because of the Kurds. It's not an invasion. It's
That's the
a
move. Yeah.
limited military operation, just like Putin.
Yeah, special military operation. Love it. You got to learn the language.
Yeah, we're in Israel. We didn't have a war in like 2 decades. We only have special operations.
There you go.
Yeah. So, well, Preston, where can people find you?
Yeah, so most of the content is on YouTube. The channel is my name, Preston Stewart, and then I also put out work on TikTok, same name, X, and Instagram.
I highly recommend it to people if you want to see the American perspective and from someone who's a veteran and knows what he's talking about. And well, Preston, thank you so much for coming on. I've really loved speaking with you. It's an honor.
Really enjoyed it there, and thank you so much for the invite.